So I was studying out for this assignment that I was given, and the text that they gave me to preach on is Romans chapter 12, verse 10. Be kindly affectioned one to another with brotherly love and honor, preferring one another. So I was supposed to do a message on preferring one another or honoring one another. And so I was just doing a little translating on the immediate context. I was in the process of translating verses 9 through 16. And I came across something that provoked my thought. And this is basically a devotional this morning, but it fits, I believe, us as Christians in our society. Let me just give it to you here. There are a number of references in the 12th and 13th chapters of Romans in particular that refer to good. There are at least two, I think there are more than that, but at least two Greek words for good in the Bible. And as a consequence of studying this out, I came to the place where I could verbalize or put into plain language the value of good. Why is good good? Why is it important to be good? Could you verbalize that? All right, there are a number of reasons why we should not be bad, but what is on the positive side, what is the value of good? And the scriptures here are quite explicit. This is the practical portion of the book of Romans. Starting in chapter 12 and going through chapter 15, he's making application of the Christian life. And I think it's quite significant that there's such an emphasis on good. Kalos is one Greek word for good, and it refers to external beauty, something that is outwardly, that people outwardly appreciate. Then it is kalos, or that would be the adjective that is used to describe a beautiful woman, or a beautiful horse, or anything that has external beauty. Agathos is the Greek word for beauty inwardly. That which in itself is good is defined as something that is both good and advantageous to the person that comes in contact with it. Whenever agathos and kalos are used together, agathos particularly stresses inner excellence. Inner excellence. Now, that is the word that I want to focus on this morning. Agathos. It's used frequently. In fact, it's the only word for good that Paul uses in Romans chapters 12 and 13. He uses both words for good in chapter 14. He comes back in chapter 15 to agathos. And it's kind of an interesting study. The first value of good is that it's the primary objective or the aspiration for the disciple. Obviously, the 12th chapter of Romans is an appeal to believers who will dedicate themselves in service to the Lord. So we're talking about discipleship here. And he appeals to us in verse 2 to stop being conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, in order that you may prove, that is, test, what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Now I'd just like to reverse this logically. He says that we're supposed to do something so that we can test what God's good will is. Well, if we turn that around and ask ourselves, what is the value of good? Good then becomes here the primary motivation, the primary objective, the goal in our lives as Christians, right? We don't necessarily know automatically what God's will is for our lives, do we? We have particular statements, but do you know what the Lord wants for your life in 5 years or 10 years, aside from continuous sanctification and so forth? If we want to know what the hidden goodness of God is, that which isn't necessarily external, but the inner excellence, if we want to prove what is essentially hidden, but is nevertheless good, according to God's will, this becomes our objective. From this, I would draw certain conclusions. I think this statement indicates that good does exist. It is something that can be experienced. It is something that characterizes God's will. And God has clearly indicated here that there are preconditions that have to be fulfilled before we can experience agathos, the agathos will of God, the good will of God, the inner excellence of following the Lord. The precondition here is simply that we must not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. That's what he says there. And that in itself is significant, because not being conformed to this world stresses that we shouldn't outwardly appear like a worldling, but in contrast we should be transformed by the renewing of your mind, which itself is an inner process. Right? If you're going to live the sanctified life as a disciple, it has to work from the inside out. I mean, you can take anybody and cut their hair and make them look like a conservative Christian. You can put a white shirt on them and a thin black tie, and you can make them wear conservative clothes. But if they're not saved, it's useless, isn't it? We all know that. So discipleship consists not in merely making ourselves look like whatever it is that a disciple should look like, but be transformed from the inside out. And this should then have an external effect or result. And only when we are in that process, willingly being transformed in our minds, that the invisible things about God's will, the hidden excellencies of God's will be then possible to know. So I think that the value of good is that it gives meaning and purpose to the demands of discipleship. If I know that if I will follow God's instructions as a disciple, if I know that at the end that He promises good, then that in itself gives meaning. Let me illustrate. If you knew that you were going to be struck with napalm if you walked across, openly walked across the parking lot this afternoon, if you're going to be bombed by a fighter jet and struck with napalm, it's going to glue itself to your skin and burn you till you died, you probably would not walk across the parking lot, right? Yeah. You might ask one of your friends to go in your place. But the point is that you would hesitate to do something because it would not have a good result, right? If we know, in fact, that there is a good result, if we believe that God's will is good, then we will take the necessary precondition. And so therefore the value of that good at the end of the rainbow is that it helps motivate me now to continue. That's obvious, sort of. Right? But it's in verse 9 it says, "Let love be without hypocrisy, abhor that which is evil, cling to that which is good." I use napalm purposely because the Greek word for cling here, or cleave, is the Greek word the verb that actually means glue, to adhere. Right? It actually means that. Be glued. It's in the passive voice. Be glued to that which is good. In other words, we as Christians are actually ordered to find whatever is good around us and stick to it. Right? Now, napalm is a horrific weapon because it's a gel-like substance and it sticks. It doesn't, it's not like water. It doesn't run off. It sticks when it hits. Consider the difference between being stuck to napalm and being stuck, let's say, in a more intimate relationship with a virtuous man or a virtuous woman. In fact, that's one of the places in the New Testament where Jesus used the same word. He says a man should leave his father and his mother and stick to his wife. He's not talking about necessarily just physical intimacy here, but he's talking about emotional and decisive, an ongoing life's relationship. And so, the effect of being intimately connected or stuck to a virtuous partner you can see the beneficial results of that, right? As Bill Peterson says, the smartest thing that his son Tim ever did was to marry a smart woman, a smarter woman. Right? That's the idea, that if you will stick to something that is good, that it will have a good effect on you. If we will stick to God's requirements for discipleship, then it will have a good dividend in the end. Now, a second value of good can be drawn from the last verse of this 12th chapter. In verses 17 to 21, he's been pursuing a line of thought in terms of Christians in relationship to those who persecute them. And his last comment is that we should not be overcome by evil, but rather, in turn, to overcome evil with good. And this is agathos here. This is not kalos or external, what looks good, but inner excellence. You overcome evil with inner excellence. How do you do that? Well, if we look at the context, verses 19 and 20 tell us what he means. I think he's already explained the principle. It's a good thing, for instance, to refuse to take vengeance into your own hand. It's a good thing to develop a confidence that God has the ability to solve your problems for you, right? Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. So don't take it into your own hands. That's how you overcome evil with good. You just refuse to become a vigilante. Refuse to get back, to get even. Alright? Verse 20. If your enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. The principle here is that a little is even more difficult. It's one thing to refuse to become a vigilante, but then are we just going to sit on the sidelines and not have anything to do? Do nothing? The Lord actually says that we should actually go in a positive step and do good to those that do evil to us. Have you ever done this? Have you actually ever done something positive for somebody that was doing evil to you? But that's negative. It's not a positive. Right? I don't know if you've ever heard Mike Warnke's testimony of how he got saved, but it was because two Christian guys in the barracks in the military got up after he punched them out and bloodied their faces and witnessed to him in a loving manner that he got saved. Good overcame evil. Right? When Jesus Christ died on the cross, what happened? A Roman soldier stood up and said, surely this was a righteous man. Christ did not revile. He did not curse. Right? So this man recognized the goodness of Christ at his death, and he became saved. When Paul and Silas were thrown into jail in Philippi, they weren't ranting and raving, they were singing hymns. And then when this guy came, they blessed him. They talked to him. They didn't run away. They did good. As a result, the man got saved. That whole story got started when Paul actually did something good for a demon-possessed girl. He cast out the demon. He did something good for her. And as a result of it, they ended up in jail, but as the end result of that, there was a church established in Philippi. So evil was overcome by good. Right? I was reading yesterday in an article that I'm saving for Missions Night. It is one of the most amazing testimonies I have ever read in my entire life. About a 14-year-old Muslim boy who eventually became a Christian, and he was blind. And the stuff that he did before he was killed 3 or 4 years ago by the Muslims in Pakistan is just phenomenal. But in the course of telling this story, the author mentioned that in the capital of Afghanistan, it's in a place called Kabul. You probably heard of it in the news. there was a Christian church. It had been built in 1959 by President Eisenhower in agreement with the then president of Afghanistan, who was a Muslim man. The Afghanis built this church, or allowed the church to be built by Christian donations from around the world, sort of in reciprocation to President Eisenhower building a mosque in Washington for the Muslim diplomats that were in his country. Well, as it turned out, the very much anti-Christian regime that followed this president of Eisenhower's day decided, as a result of the testimony of this boy that the article was about, so many people were getting saved that they destroyed the Christian church in town. They destroyed it, and instead of, protesting everything, the Christians got around and they fed the soldiers who were destroying the church tea and cookies. They fed the soldiers tea and cookies as they were destroying their church. And within a year's time, when people were fleeing the country because of the downfall of the communist the government to the communists, many of the Afghanis recognized that these Christians it was a good thing that they had done, judgment for persecuting the Christians, so it was, the end result was a good thing. These Christians really impressed the Afghanis. So the value of good itself is an agent to victory over evil. Not only is it a primary objective, not only does it provide motivation for us as disciples, but it also is an agent to actually overcoming evil. A third value of good is that it produces peace. It establishes peace. It produces goodwill and appreciation in society and government. Chapter 13, verses 3 and 4. Rulers are not a terror to agathos works, to good works, the works that are good by the very nature, but to evil. Will you then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is agathos, which is essentially good, and you shall have praise of the same, for he is God's minister to thee for good, agathos. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he bears not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, an avenger to execute wrath on him that does evil. That's an interesting passage. Do that which is good, and you shall have praise of the same. That sort of makes sense, right? I mean, if you're going around helping little old ladies across the street, if you're giving money to people, if you are setting up help programs for people that get burned out in fires, if you are setting up programs as Christians to help AIDS victims, if you're helping refugees that come into this country, if you're doing good things, does the government have anything against that? Actually, the government is going to be very happy, very thankful, show public appreciation for such things, right? Good brings out the best in people, both in society and government. The doing of good itself is an ameliorating factor in social relations. It produces public displays of appreciation by authorities. Think of it this way. Even governments that are hostile to, say, Christian missions will allow Christian doctors in. Because what? They're doing good. See? And so that Christian doctor is an ameliorating influence even in a hostile country. Look at the present case in point. Iraq has been at war with the coalition for months. And it's surprising that Saddam Hussein has allowed these Western news reporters into his country. This, right there in the middle of the country. They don't have a lot of freedoms, but in his viewpoint, those reporters are doing a good thing. They are showing the devastating effects of the Allied bombing. In his view, that the Americans and the coalition partners are actually doing bad things to the populace, right, to the citizens. And so, from Saddam Hussein's point of view, these Westerners are actually doing a good thing for him, so he's allowing them in the country, right? Which proves that if some government thinks you're doing a good thing, regardless of what else is true about you, they will very often let you work. There's appreciation and praise. A perfect cross-reference to this is Galatians chapter 5, verse 22 and 23. When Paul sets up a contrast here in this chapter between the works of the flesh and the fruits of the Spirit, he makes a very profound point. He describes the fruit of the Spirit as love, joy, peace. These are all good things. Long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, self-control. Look at the next statement. Against such there is no law. Against such there is no law. Right? That's a profound statement. Against such there is no law. There has never been a law passed by, let me put it this way, I believe that there probably are cases where governments have, they actually do twist evil and call it good and good evil. Isaiah lamented that in the Old Testament, that Israel had turned, its whole value system was screwed up and upside down. But normal government, good government that is legitimate government, by its very nature has no laws against the expression of goodness or peace or long-suffering or gentleness or goodness or faith or meekness or temperance. Right? Good government is actually against the opposite of those things. Idolatry, sorcery, hatred, strife, jealousy, wrath, faction, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, all that other stuff. That's what create laws. Right? So good things are in harmony with law, not opposed to it. So a third value of good, then, is that it maintains public peace. It maintains, it produces peace and stability to society. It produces goodwill from government to individuals. Again, that's sort of self-explanatory, but it's a third value of good. I personally believe this is an argument that you need to be making. That it's your generation is going to face the real effects of humanism and multiculturalism. You will grow up, either you or your children, if the Lord tarries, you are going to have to face a society that is going to begin to reap the consequences of having value systems that are not good. For example, Islam teaches holy jihad against the infidel. Right? So anybody that is not Islamic, if these people actually practice their religion, they're going to bring violence to this country. Religious violence. Christianity doesn't do that. We don't shoot people for not becoming Christians. Islam does. They kill people for not becoming Muslim. It just, to me, I can't understand why this is not more evident in society. Why people in the know don't realize that Christianity actually does good things. It has good results, whereas Sikhism and Islam, you might as well say Satanism and occultism, these other religious belief systems produce evil. Christianity produces good. Yeah. So the value of good. And one last point, chapter 15, verse 2. There's been a whole chapter set aside in this application section of the book of Romans to edifying one another. He concludes then in verse 1 and 2 and 3, we then that are strong, we believers, ought to bear the infirmities of the weak and not to please ourselves. For every one of us let every one of us please his neighbor for his good. That is, agathos, inward excellence, to edification. For even Christ pleased not himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of them that reproach thee fell on me. key verse is verse 2. Let every one of us please his neighbor for his good to edification, which obviously indicates that good produces edification. Edification, building up, strengthening, establishing, encouraging, spiritual growth are dependent upon doing good. Let me illustrate. If you lead one of your friends to Christ and then start doing bad things to them, are they going to grow? Of course not. If you want them to grow, you have to do good things for them. You have to nurture them. It's to be patient. You have to demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit. Let's broaden it out and look on an ecclesiastical level. In a local church, is the church going to grow? Is it going to be self-edifying? Is it going to be spiritually maturing if people are not doing good things? It's going to be self-destructing. Church in Corinth is a case in point. That's why we have chapters 12, 13, and 14 in the book of 1 Corinthians. The church was an exceptionally gifted church. They had all the gifts there. Right? But the gifts were not being exercised in love. So it wasn't the good or proper exercise of spiritual gifts. What was the result? Lack of edification, division, schism. And so the 14th chapter of 1 Corinthians tells us that, listen, the reason why you should be de-emphasizing tongues and all these other special phenomena and emphasizing prophecy and teaching the Word of God is so that people will be edified. You have to do good things. There's be a good balance. Now, I'm going to stop there. I'm sure there's lots more. I've only run 4 or 5 references in 2 or 3 chapters here. I just feel that we shouldn't put so much an emphasis on external beauty in deeds even, or in our own personal lives, but should work at inner excellence. Real good that exudes from a good heart. And that will have tremendous effects. So, if good is so productive, if good does all these things, then what should we as believers do? Let's conclude. Romans 12:2 says that we should continue in sanctified living, because that produces good. Romans 12:21 says that we should continually purpose to respond to evil in a Christ-like manner, because that is good. That wins. Romans 13 verses 3 and 4, we should continuously submit to government regulations. We should be law-abiding citizens, because that produces good. Good things come out of that. Romans 15:2, we should continually act in a sensitive way to fellow believers, because that produces edification, or at least a situation in which people can be edified. This is the responsibility of disciples. Of course, there are going to be Christians that don't act like this, but they aren't disciples. There's a world of difference between a Christian and a disciple. And this is for people who are dedicated to the Lordship of Jesus Christ, submitting to His will. The value of good. Just a few thought provokers. You might want to pursue that, running a few references on your own. Hoshea is succeeded by King Hezekiah, who was a good king for almost 30 years. Chapter 18 and 19 record his wars with Assyria and his victories over the Assyrians as well. The book of Isaiah is a commentary, by the way, on Hezekiah's problems. And remember the Lord gave him 15 extra years because he prayed.
Better if he did.
Pardon?
I thought it was 10 extra years.
No, it was 15 years he got. But he was foolish because he opened the doors, the city, and let people, emissaries, in during times of peace. And
Didn't I'll say it was better if he would have been better if he didn't. He sinned more during that time.
Yeah. It was just a postponement of the end. Well, Anyway, Hezekiah was generally a good king, although he ended up as a failure. Manasseh, his son, who reigned twice as long as he did, almost, was a very idolatrous and evil king. Followed by Ammon, and then Josiah, who was a good king. So Hezekiah, and then two bad kings for a long time, and then Josiah, who had about a 31-year reign. He repaired the temple, and there were revivals under him, reinstituted the Passover. And then he's followed by Jehoahaz and Eliakim, whose name was changed to Jehoiakim, then finally Jehoiakim. And it was under Jehoahaz that Pharaoh came up from Egypt, and I think that's when Jeremiah was captivated. And his brother Eliakim was put on the throne, and he was subsequently subdued by Babylon. So you had a few puppet rulers in Jerusalem during this period of time, just for a very short time. Mattaniah, 11 years. Gedaliah, the governor of Palestine, for 7 months, and Jehoiakim was captivated to Babylon, and after 37 years at least. The book ends that way. We'll pick up in our next class with the keys to the book, looking at some of the spiritual characteristics of some of these people. We got started a little bit late today, Ken. This is Monday morning, or it feels like Monday morning. We'll have to fast forward to the end of the tape, and we'll pick up with theology there.